Hi all, so I'm going to go over again very briefly the highlights, terms you need to know for chapter 2, which focuses on power and privilege. So an important thing, again, that we don't often think about is our social identity. So how all the aspects of our lives and the people we interact with and identify with really identify us and determine things like where we live, who we live with, the type of job we feel like we can get, the type of education we feel like we can get. And for each of these social identities, there is a group that, at least in American and most of Western society, that is considered sort of in power, and a group that has less power. So for example, something like age. Adults tend to have the most power, but children, adolescents, the elderly, not so much. Those with less power for developmental disability are neurodivergent individuals, those with things like autism spectrum disorders. Similar, anyone who has any kind of disability, physical, cognitive, psychological, is seen as less than. In America, certainly Christianity is seen as sort of the norm. Anyone who is any other sides of non-Christian, particularly Jews and Muslims, and unfortunately, as we've seen in recent years, are seen as having less power. European Americans, white, Caucasian individuals have the power. Pretty much anyone else, nope. Social class, middle class, and educated people, and obviously certainly higher class, the 1%, exactly. Poor and working class people are the ones with less power. Sexual orientation, heterosexual people, indigenous background, those who are Native Americans, First Nations peoples, American Indians, they call themselves lots of different things, and I respect the terms they use to self-identify, have less power. And unfortunately, again, with things like the COVID-19 outbreak, we're seeing that. So for example, the Navajo Nation has the highest rates of COVID-19 infection of anywhere else in the US. People born in the US are seen as better off than immigrants and refugees. And then for gender, it's men, right? And if you identify with any other gender, not so much. So dominant groups benefit because they have access to power and resources. They're the ones who establish society's norms and standards. And so then if you don't conform to those, you're deviant, you're less than. They have limited awareness or knowledge about the subordinate groups. They kind of don't care about them, right? They're believed to be competent and credible. They're given the benefit of the doubt. So even someone who has no experience, for example, will be taken at face value if they're in the dominant group, and not so much if they're in the subordinate group, even if they do have everything they need. Create truth or reality. They decide what's true. They decide what's real, you know. The dominant group is seen as individuals. The subordinate group is really that they're expected always to speak for everyone of their group. And then the dominant group has a sense of belonging, where those in the subordinate group feel invisible, or sometimes the opposite, hyper-visible, as like a group to be called out. So privilege is something that we all have to some extent. For example, even just your ability to take this class, right? To have the money and the time to take this class is an aspect of privilege, right? So even though you yourself may not think of yourself as privileged at all, believe it or not, you do have some privilege. So unearned entitlements are part of this. So people who are in the privileged group have a bunch of things that they don't have to worry about. There are hoops they don't have to jump through. There are ways they don't have to prove themselves. Privileged groups are seen as the normal or the default. Again, as we talked about last time, even to the point of like who gets researched, right, and who is defined as normal. So for example, things like heart attacks. The symptoms we tend to think of as indicative of a heart attack are true for men, in particular white men. They often manifest in women in very different ways. So instead of like chest pain, arm pain, in women it's sometimes nausea. But because we're all taught that the hallmark symptoms of a heart attack are the symptoms that are really more stereotypical for men. We sometimes miss heart attacks in women. Visibility. So people who are in the privileged group are seen. You get to see them in movies, in novels, right, on TV every day. If you think about like romantic comedies, just for an example, right? So the vast majority of them involve heterosexual couples, right? There are some exceptions and some notably good exceptions to that rule, but they are exceptions at this point. Conferred dominance, just by virtue of being born the way you are, right? What existential psychologists would call your thrownness, where you come to exist in time and place. You get things and respect because of it. And your beliefs are legitimized. No one ever questions, why do you believe that way? Or says something like, oh, your ideas are crazy, right? As happens to minority groups. Privilege is often invisible to those experiencing it. And this is really, really important because, again, every one of us watching this right now, regardless of your status, has some sort of privilege. And that's really hard for people to wrap their head around because we don't tend to think of ourselves as privileged, right? But it's true. And it's because it's invisible because we don't have to deal with any consequences of it. One of my favorite readings related to this, I do have students do in my intro women's and gender studies class, is a man who talks about until he started talking about issues of gender, like had never really thought about himself as having a gender. Sort of mind-boggling to people who identify as women or non-binary, right? Same thing can happen here. Scapegoating can happen as a result of privilege. Because you've had things come to you more easily, you might be like, well, why can't these people in X group do just as well as me? This relates back to the idea of like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps that we talked about last time, that again, not feasible when the lines start at completely different places, right? Okay, so important terms here. Sexism. This is discrimination, prejudice on the basis of sex, gender. And your book will talk later about how it really combines sex/gender because of the way our world doesn't understand the difference. But a quick thumbnail, sex is biological, gender is social. A stereotype is ideas we have about a person because of a group that they belong to. And then gender roles are these ideas of like what our culture says you should do or how you should act or what you should believe because of your gender. Self-stereotyping can happen when we believe and buy into these stereotypes about our groups, and so we can act in the way that's sort of expected to us. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Doing gender is a concept that theorist Judith Butler really described really well. She has some great papers about this, but the idea that gender is performative, right? That like the way we dress, the way we talk, the way that we go about doing things have so much more to do with gender than anything that's innate, right? And that we're trained to do this from a very, very early age. Really, some would argue before we're even born. Backlash effects we talked about last time. If you step out of the line of those gender roles, right, it's not going to go well. And especially if you are identifying with sort of like the weaker version of that. So one of the important things to think about is the difference between prejudice and discrimination. Essentially, prejudice is the attitudes that you have towards people because of a group that they identify with. And discrimination is behavior you perform towards those people because of that group and also because of your prejudice, your attitude. So, for example, prejudice might be believing people are XYZ way. Discrimination might be not hiring someone because they belong to a certain group. Overt sexism is what we can see, what is more easily available to us. And this is what we typically think of when we think of sexism. But there are other ways of sexism occurring. One of these is microaggressions. And these are also really problematic for any kind of group. So particularly racial microaggressions, but also those towards sexual and gender minorities. These are the result of stereotyping They might seem ambiguous or neutral. Selective incivility, they're called sometimes. I thought people like you, blah, blah, blah. My daughter's approaching 2, and there's a great book about this that we read to her. It's called Red or Blue, I Like You. It stars Elmo and a blue monster. And it's like full of microaggressions to really illustrate how problematic they are. Like, oh, I didn't know blue monsters liked that kind of food too. Those are microaggressions. Unaddressed microaggressions are associated with decreased self-esteem, increased anger and frustration, and we know all those things are related to mental and physical health problems. So going beyond the overt sexism we typically think of, what you'll hear called modern or ambivalent sexism is the idea that there are covert types of sexism, there are sexisms that are not as obvious. So hostile sexism is, again, what we typically think of when we think of sexism, thinking you can't do something because of your gender. Benevolent sexism is something that is often overlooked, but just as problematic, if not more so, according to research. And this is the idea that, like, women should be cared for and put on a pedestal, that they're fragile, so we should open doors for them and not let them do certain things because we just need to revere them. And this is paternalistic chivalry. This is the idea that, like, women are essentially kids that we need to take care of. It's obviously problematic, and as I mentioned, the research shows that this is just as harmful, if not more so, than hostile sexism to women mentally. Language is really important when we talk about gender. It's something that's often overlooked, I think, but very, very important. So examples of gender biased language is using man to mean all people. A lot of people just say, oh, that was just the way we used to talk, blah, 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 blah. We don't talk that way anymore. Let's stick human in there instead, right? Imbuing male assumptions on a gender neutral description, right? So if we read a description as something as simple as like a cat, right? We'd be like, oh, well, he, blah, 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 blah. We don't know. Could be a female cat. We don't know, right? Naming men first in a pair, he or she, king and queen. And using unmarked language for men, but then marking language for women. So host versus hostess, steward versus stewardess, actor versus actress. And this is worse in languages beyond English where terms are actually gendered. So for example, in French, the word le médecin, médecin, which means doctor, is male. Gender-fair language refers to all people with symmetrical language forms. So you'll see the term Latinx used quite frequently now. And this is so that we are not saying Latina or Latino. It's so that we can just say, refer to everybody with one term. Last quick thing to talk about is pronouns. So for your video for this week, I'm asking you to tell us what your pronouns are that you use. So I use she, her, hers pronouns. And so this just means I identify as female and I prefer to be referred to as she or her. You can identify as female and prefer to be identified with any of these other pronouns. So one of the things that makes some people uncomfortable grammatically is using they as a singular. Actually, for much of language's history, it has been used that way. It was really only in the 1800s in the UK when they started writing laws using he and him as the gender neutral, that this became grammatically incorrect. So actually the American Psychological Association has moved to they as their gender neutral pronoun. But that doesn't mean that's the one you have to use if you identify as non-binary, for example. There are other things like Z that you can use instead. So using someone's pronouns as they are identified is really important. We used to use the term preferred pronouns, but we've done away with that, and it's just your pronouns. It's not which ones you prefer to be called, it's the pronouns you identify with. So again, asking everybody to give us your pronouns in your video so we know how to refer to you respectfully. Alrighty, I will see you in the discussion boards.